In this lesson, we are going to look at the requirements analysis. Really what we do here is, first you have to identify the requirements, and then to identify the correct requirements, you have to, as the systems analyst, you will have to really understand what the user needs, and therefore what the system must do, and the correct systems. What we mean by correct systems is really what the users need to solve their problems. Such systems can only be built if you know exactly what the system must do, and that you have to come to an understanding of what the user really requires. Therefore, the most important factor in building correct systems is to first clearly define what the system must do. For that, we should have a better communication between system users and the analysts, because it is the system users' problems that you are trying to solve. So, therefore, you must have a good communication between the users and the analyst. Why we say that communication is so important in this process is, when we talk to people, try to identify what their problems are, there can be many ambiguities arising from these conversations. And you may not understand exactly what the user means. And also sometimes we tend to use certain words in certain professions, like when you take information technology, you may use words like dis and net and web and all kinds of things, but maybe people in other professions may not understand what we mean by those words. And similarly, in other professions there may be certain terms that they use which we may not interpret properly. So, therefore, that also can arise to problems. So, this a good communication process will really reduce the misunderstandings between the end users and the developers. Now, this is a good example of showing what we really mean by ambiguous requirement statement. Now, this says identify the mode of transportation to transfer a single individual from home to place of work. So, that is a requirement. Now, what the user interpreted when he wanted this, he wanted some mode of transportation from his home to the place of work. What the user had in mind was this car. He thought, yes, what I want is a car. What the management really wanted to give him was only a bicycle. How did the IT, information technologists, interpret it? He thought this is a kind of thing that has to be provided. So, you can see the misunderstanding here. User has one thing in mind, and the people who are in charge of these users or the higher management has another thing in their minds, and we interpret it in a different way as systems analysts. So, finally, if we deliver a product like this, if we are thinking of software systems or altogether systems of software and hardware, the users will have a certain requirement in their minds, and the management also may have misinterpreted these user requirements, and we in turn as analysts, we go and interpret it in another way. So, finally, the system that is built out of such misconceptions would be a totally misfit, or it will not be acceptable to the users. Therefore, it will be a flop. And what are the disadvantages of this not identifying the user requirements correctly? The system will exceed time schedules and cost schedules. That is, if we have not identified these user requirements from the very beginning itself, we may not plan for them, like we may not devote the money that is needed to implement those requirements, or we may not allow time for these requirements to be built into the system. So, therefore, our time plannings and cost plannings will all go for a 6. And the user may not be satisfied with the system requirements, because if you have delivered something which is not to the expectation of the users, they will not be happy with it. Therefore, they may not even use the system. So, it will be a total waste of money and time and effort and all that. And the cost of maintenance may be excessively high, because later on, once you put the system into working order, and if people find that certain things are lacking or their system is not doing exactly what they expected the system to do, Then you have to do maintenance, means you have to do various changes so that the users are satisfied with the system. Then at that point, if you try to do changes, it will be the cost may be very high, and that may not be acceptable again. System may be unreliable and prone to errors. There may be certain errors, or maybe it's unreliable, not fully fulfilling the expectations of the users really. So therefore, this reputation of the IT staff on the team also will be tarnished, because the word will go around that you are not a reliable team of people who really deliver what the users want at the time that they want and at a cost that they want, because time schedules can exceed the planning and cost schedules can exceed the planning. All this is because you have not identified the user requirements properly from the very beginning itself. So, how do we really discover these requirements? There are various stages of it. It consists of problem discovery and analysis. We discussed this in a previous chapter, and actually there I like to recall your memory to that example that we discussed in that lesson, that is about this mother taking the little child to the doctor because the child is sick. So, mother has identified certain problems. The child has a fever, the child is restless. So, she has been giving him painkillers and medicine to control the temperature, but nothing has really made the child well. So, she goes to the doctor, and then between the doctor and the parent, and there will be a dialogue, and doctor will ask various questions. He will observe the child, he will take the child's temperature and so on, and by looking at all these symptoms that he can see, and then with the expertise that he has gained, he is able to identify what the real problem is. Now, the mother thought the problem was this fever and all that, and she treated the child for that, but the actual cause was not that. So, the doctor's ability to look at the symptoms and analyze those symptoms and come to a conclusion that this is the problem is really the analysis process, and then after that, of course, he prescribes the medicine. So, the requirements discovery is also something like that. The process and techniques used by systems analysts to identify or extract system problems and requirements from the user community. And then once he has done that, he will document all these requirements and analyze the requirements, just as the doctor did. Maybe he did not write all these the problems that he found, like all the symptoms that he found, he may not have written down, because this is just one simple case for him that he is trying to diagnose. But in this case, the analyst may be totally new to the environment that he is going into. The doctor, when we are sick only, we go to the doctor. So, the doctor is very he is trained to identify these symptoms, he has his expertise, and it is his field of knowledge, it is medicine, right. But in this case, maybe you have never been exposed to an environment like that, the type of business that goes on there, it may be totally new to the analysts and the team. So, therefore, all the requirements that you identify, you may have to document them, and then later on analyze these requirements and find out exactly what these requirements are, and then you have to find the solutions. The next stage in this is the requirements management, because as you go along in a system development project, you will find that the scope of the project or certain requirements that you have not identified at the early stages may crop up later on. That is because at the very initial stages, you do not really do a very detailed analysis. As you get into the project only, you do the detailed analysis, and when you do the detailed analysis only, you will find certain requirements, maybe you have missed them earlier, or maybe you have misunderstood those requirements. So, from time to time, this again we discussed in an earlier, there are in the earlier lesson, there are various points at which you have to take a look back and see whether what you have identified are still valid or not. So, can start to define requirements after understanding the problem properly, and must use effective methods for gathering information. That is, gathering information means from the actual users you are trying to find out what this system is really doing now and what is really wrong with it, and what are the things that you should really do to this system to make it better or make it work better. So, after completing the process of fact finding, use various tools to document the requirements. So, as you identify these various requirements, there are various techniques that you can use to find the requirements, and at the same time using various tools you document these things, because you can't keep all these things in your head, because it is a very complex situation. So, the requirements discovery, the process and techniques used by systems analysts to how to identify, how to analyze and how to understand these system requirements. And during this process you can see the analyst really has to work with the systems owners. System owners means most of the time the higher management, and the actual system users, the people who are in the operational levels who are actually using the system. So, the analyst has to always communicate with these people and work with these people to identify the requirements of the system that is needed. So, the system requirements, what does it really do? It specifies what the information system must do or what property or quality the system must have. The first thing is what this information system must do, that is of primary importance, because it must satisfy all those functionalities that are expected by the users. And also in these expectations there must be certain there may be certain properties or qualities that the system must have. We will look at these things in a little detail. So, system requirements specify, these functional requirements specify what the information system must do. They must actually do those things. If the system does not carry out these functions, then it has not addressed the user requirements at all. Non-functional requirements, that is what we said in the previous slide, properties or qualities that it should have. After satisfying all these functional requirements, it should have also certain qualities in it, and those are what we know, what we call non-functional requirements. So, these non-functional requirements only specify a property or quality of the system that we must have. So, like user friendliness in a system, then the security aspects of it. So, there are more things in this under this category. You can refer to the page 209. There is a very good table here in the reference 1 book, table 6.1, that gives a whole list of other qualities or properties that a system must have in addition to the functional requirements. So, functional requirements are of the utmost importance, they should be there, but whereas these are, I would say, like nice to have things, and out of those things also there may be certain things which are really very important, things like security and so on. So, system requirements can be gathered by using discussions with users about their requirements or about their problems, and building systems that satisfy these requirements. So, once you have analyzed all these information that you have gathered from the users, then you start building your system, and the systems that you finally build will have to satisfy these requirements. System requirements should meet the following criteria. They should be consistent, not conflicting or ambiguous, because when you try to build new systems or change an existing system, you will be talking to a lot of people here, not just one person in the organization. You will be talking to people at different levels also, the higher management, lower working people. So, different people will come up with different kind of problems. It is their perception of the problem that they are going to talk to you about. So, one person's use may not be another person's use really, or one person's problem may not be the other person's problem. What as the analyst, what you have to do is you have to understand that among these user needs there may be conflicting needs. That is, if you satisfy one, you are going to dissatisfy the other one, or one person will say one thing and the other person will say another thing. So, it would be very confusing and ambiguous to the without giving the exact meaning in it. But whatever it is, you have to resolve as the analyst. You have to come to you have to understand what are the priorities for the organization. That is, different users may have different requirements, but you cannot, most of the time you cannot satisfy all those requirements, and it is really not necessary also. But you have from the point of the organization, what are these requirements that are really essential for the organization, and it is those requirements that you really have to satisfy. Complete, describe all possible system inputs and responses. So, in every way it has to be complete, in the sense that you cannot ignore certain requirements and just concentrate only on a few requirements. Feasible, we have discussed this feasibility from different aspects. So, feasibility is satisfied based on the available resources and various other constraints that we have discussed earlier. Required, whether these are truly needed in the organization. Again, we discussed in the previous lesson, the money that is, or the finances that are available to an organization can be, they can invest this money in different ways. And what businesses really try to do is, they try to invest their money in the where they can get the highest profits out of it. So, whether these modifications or whether these changes that people are asking for, really the users or the end users are asking, whether they are really needed in that organization and fulfill the purpose of the system. Sometimes we know people come up with various problems, and even if you go and introduce information technology into those systems, those solutions cannot solve those problems. Those problems may be solved in other ways. They may be personnel problems or problems like that. So, introducing a new information technology system is not going to solve such problems. So, when you identify problems, you have to really decide as the analyst whether these are problems which can be really solved through IT solutions and whether they are really required. Accurate. So, we have to be very specific when we specify these requirements, or when we write down, or when we communicate with the users. They must be stated correctly, because there can be misconceptions again, and the user may expect one thing, whereas you are going to deliver something else. So, therefore, accuracy is very important. Traceable, directly map to the functions and features of the system. So, if you give a solution, you should be able to trace it to the actual function. Why are you suggesting this? What is the problem that it is going to solve, and which feature of the system will solve your problem? So, because the users will be very interested in how is this new solution that you are giving, how does it solve their problem. Verifiable, defined so that they can be demonstrated during testing, because once you implement a system, there will be a testing stage. During this testing stage, of course, testing is done at different levels in the development life cycle. At those testing levels, you should be able to test and prove that whether whatever you are proposing through this new system has been really achieved. So, you should be able to test and verify. Then documenting and analyzing requirements, assemble or document the gathered information in a draft requirement in an organized, understandable, meaningful way. Because whenever you gather information, as I told you previously also, it is not just a child with a fever that a mother takes to a doctor. Maybe now, if we look at a very complicated medical case, then we know that doctors will ask for reports, blood reports and x-rays and various things. What are those really? Those are documents. And then to find a solution, they will look at, it's not only their not in only in a simple case they would be able to diagnose without any reports and x-rays and so on. But in a complicated situation they will always depend on these things rather than depending on what they have in their minds. So, similarly these are systems are also complex entities. Therefore, we have to whatever the information that we gather about them, we have to document in an organized manner and in an understandable manner, which means we also should be able to understand as analysts, and the users also should be able to judge whether you have really understood what they have meant and in a meaningful way. Provide all these documents will provide a direction for the modeling techniques later on. So, documenting the requirements, use various tools to draft the initial findings. So, sometimes you will use text to or just narration to describe your findings, or you may use tools like use cases which describe the system functions from the external user's perspective. Because these kind of use cases we are using because it will be easy for the users to understand them, because it is from their perspective that we are going to it is like drawing a diagram and showing someone, and then they will be able to, if it is a diagram that they can understand, they will be able to verify whether that diagram is accurate or not. And what are called decision tables, that is another tool that can be used at this point to document an organization's complex business policies and decision making rules. Now, we know if we take a simple trading organization, they have different policies for different customers, like they may have their wholesale customers, then they may have another policy for billing policy for cash customers, that is those who are paying cash and purchasing, or there may be certain customers who are given 1 month credit facilities, or there may be others who get a 3-month credit facility. So, there may be very, and also bulk purchasing, there may be certain customers who make bulk purchases. So, when there are complex situations like that, you can easily use a decision table to those business policies and decision making rules can be easily identified using those decision tables, and later on based on that you can design your programs, computer programs. Then the requirement tables, these document each specific requirement. So, these kind of tools you will later on use in the actual process to document the requirements. Then analyzing the requirements, fact finding activities produce requirements that are in conflict with one another. So, that is what I earlier also said, because you are going to talk to a lot of people in an organization. When you talk to a lot of people, you will get conflicting interests or conflicting requirements. One requirement will conflict with another, because you cannot satisfy both those requirements because one is in conflict with the other. So, therefore, you do the requirement analysis activity. Discover and resolve the problems with the requirements, reach agreement on any modifications to satisfy the stakeholders. So, definitely when there are conflicting requirements, you cannot implement both, you cannot solve both those problems. So, you have to come to agreement. This is I would say like a process of negotiation between the analysts and those various stakeholders, users of the system, so that you can come up or you can arrive at a successful solution. Requirement management help to alleviate the many problems associated with changing requirements. So, as I said, as you get into more and more details in the system, there can be a requirement change. New requirements may emerge or changing existing requirements. So, when these things happen, there must be a certain way in which we implement these things. That is like, say some user comes and tells you very informally, I would like this kind of thing incorporated into this system. Now, such informal requests cannot be, we cannot really encourage that kind of informal statements. So, therefore, there will be various policies, procedures, processes, how to accommodate these changing requirements, whether they are new requirements. Sometimes your time schedules and the budget controls may not allow this kind of requirements to be built into the system, because the original budgets and time schedules did not take these new requirements into account. So, therefore, there must be policies, procedures and processes, formal procedures to deal with such changing requirements, and I would like you to refer to page 215 in the reference book. Then what are these fact find or information gathering or requirement gathering techniques that we use in the systems analysis process? Fact finding is a very formal process, uses techniques to collect or gather information about system requirements, problems, preferences. So, there are requirements, there are problems that have to be solved, there may be different ways of solving these problems, and then how do you really, what is the more preferred way of solving the problem, also known as information gathering, used across the entire cycle. So, it is not only at the beginning, but this kind of information gathering will go on during the entire development life cycle. Extremely critical in the requirement analysis phase. Why we say it is extremely critical in this requirement analysis phase is because the sooner in the system development life cycle you identify the user requirements accurately, then you cannot make a mistake, because you have spent a lot of time in analysis and tried to identify as much as possible the actual user requirements and whether they can be implemented, technically feasible and so on, rather than going to the design stage or something and then realizing that you have not understood the user requirements properly, and then you have to do some changes. By that time you would have spent some time in the project, and also you would have spent some money, and then you will be, it will be too costly to implement changes at that point. So, that is why we always stress that you spend as much time as possible in this requirement analysis phase rather than in the other phases, because the more you identify the correct requirements, you will be able to deliver a better successful system to the users. And in the development cycle, say supposing you have gone into the coding stage and then realize that there are some wrong assumptions that you have made and some wrong requirements that you have identified, then it will be definitely too costly to go back and do those changes. Then what are the fact finding techniques that we use? The most important way of doing it is, or the easiest is, sampling of the existing documents. That is, existing documents, like if you take a sales system, you will see invoices, you will see goods dispatch notices, you will see invoices, purchase orders, that kind of thing, and then you will see your customers details. So, sampling of existing documents is one very good method, and interviews, face to face interviews with the actual people who are doing the work. Later on we will explain in more detail the advantages and disadvantages of each one of these methods. Then observations of the work environment. This is also a very useful way of gathering information, but there are again advantages and disadvantages to it. Prototyping. Prototyping is a very useful technique, because if you are really not sure at the beginning what the user's requirements are really, this is a very useful technique that you can use. Questionnaires. If you have to satisfy a very large clientele, if your users are distributed among many geographical areas, then this is a good technique to use. Research and site visits. Why we say research is, nowadays on the internet you can get a lot of information. So, somewhere someone would have implemented systems like this, have solved problems like what you are now faced with. So, therefore, you do not have to redo this whole thing all over again, produce the wheel all over again, because it is available somewhere. So, you can go and research into this, maybe in the internet or maybe in other organizations, if they have no objection to your coming and seeing how they have solved that problem. Those can be very useful and will save a lot of time. And finally, this joint requirements planning. What we mean is at the very beginning itself you get the users of the system involved into the planning. So, therefore, it is a matter of this finding this kind of information and fact gathering with the help of the users. Then we will look at this sampling of existing documents, that is documentation that is existing in an organization. So, you, as the analyst, you walk into an organization which may be totally new to you. This kind of business environment maybe you may not have encountered anywhere else before. So, you are studying in an existing system, you can get a good idea by studying existing documentation, various forms that they use in the system, application forms. Say as an example, you apply for a driving license. I am quite sure you have to go and fill a form somewhere. You apply for a birth certificate, you have to fill a form. So, these forms are data collecting forms. So, some of these forms people use to gather various data from the data needed for this purpose. Like if they want to give the birth certificate, when the child's given name and the parents' names, grandfathers, whatever. So, all those details have to be given, the date of birth and the place of birth and so on. Now, in these forms sometimes you tend to look at blank forms. Now, when you look at a blank form, sometimes it is difficult to decide, are all these spaces really needed, how are they using it. These blank spaces that they have in the form, the data that they capture from those spaces, do they really use them? How frequently do they use them, or do they use them at all? They just ask for the sake of asking, but they do not make use of it. So, when you are studying forms, it is always better to look at filled forms rather than blank forms. Then the files in the organization, like customers files, product files and various, sometimes they may be manual files, sometimes they may be all computerized files. And the first document that analysts should seek out is the organizational chart. Some organizations may not have a hard like structured organizational chart, but anyway you have to at least draw the diagram yourself and see who is in overall control, then who are the people doing various jobs, so that you can get an overall structure of the organization that you are studying. Should be analyzed to make sure that they are relevant and up to date. So, sometimes these organizational charts also do not get updated properly. So, you should look at them and see that they are brought up to date if they are not up to date. Research and site visits. So, thoroughly research the problem domain. So, what we say is researching is either the analyst may have done this kind of solving this kind of problem before in a previous system, or if the analyst has no such exposure, maybe somebody else has done it somewhere. If you have access to that place, you can go visit provided they give you permission, or you can always go to the internet and find the material that are relevant and reliable. This actually cuts a lot of time spent on analysis. So, computer trade journals, internet, intranets, reference books, World Wide Web. So, these are very good sources of information. And before we go into the actual methodologies, there is one thing that I would like to talk about. These are fact finding ethics. What we call ethics are really unwritten rules. Written rules are the laws of the country or the rules of an organization or whatever, but these ethics are things that we really cannot say they are rules, but your own rules and regulations that you have towards society. So, during these fact finding techniques, you will come across very sensitive data, employee profiles such as their salaries, their performance history, their medical history, their career plans, things like that. If it is about the organization itself, you will find some data which are very sensitive in nature, and which would be very valuable to their competitors. So, therefore, these once you have access to an organization, their files, their data, you should treat that data and files and all that very you should guard them closely. You should not divulge that information that you acquire during the gathering of information to outside parties who can be their competitors, and leaving sensitive documents in plain view on the desks or publicly discuss sensitive data could cause great harm to the organization. So, by discussing these things in public, this information that you gather during the information gathering process, if you keep on discussing them in public, or if you keep these files and various things, files that have been given to you in confidence, you just keep them open on desks and so on and leave for your tea break or whatever, that is not a very good thing, and your reputation is also at a stake, because you will be labeled as a person who is not very reliable. So, therefore, analysts must take great care to protect security and privacy of any facts or data that they gather during this fact finding times. So, ethics are those things, unwritten laws. Then the fact finding techniques again, observation of the work environment, that is one method we said, observation of the work environment. So, systems analysts really participate, actually they go and do the work themselves, or they watch a person perform activities to learn about the system or what the organization is doing. Often used when validity of data collected through other methods is in question, that is, you have gathered some information by some other technique, you want to validate, you want to find out whether what you have gathered is really true or not. The complexity of certain aspects of the system prevents a clear explanation by the end users, because the end users terminology or the way they describe these things, maybe you haven't understood, you feel that you have not understood the processes correctly. So, therefore, you go and observe people doing that work. So, that may be another way, but again we will look at the advantages and disadvantages of these methods.